Hello, I'm Katrice Williams, the Senior Criminal Justice Fellow of the Cleveland Foundation, and I'm joined by Lisa from NEOH Solutions, and we'll be going over today's roadmap, which will be an overview and timeline review. We are providing grant writing assistance in this particular session, and so we'll cover things to consider before applying, general best practices, application sections, resources, and we also have several points throughout this presentation with which you can ask questions. And I also will be giving a brief background about the Foundation's policy priorities. Again, grantees are not limited to these, and discussing our theory of change and why we have this RFP. And yes, I will send out the slides. Lisa, could you do from current slide? Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, wait a second. Did it transfer for you?
No, it's not showing the current slide.
Hang on 1 second. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Let's see what happens if I do it this way.
You just have to go to slideshow and from current slide.
Slides. All right.
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that.
No problem. These are the policy priorities for the Cleveland Foundation. Again, applicants are not limited to these. I just wanted to share them so that folks can understand. We developed these priorities with a 25-person advisory committee. But in short, what they are is looking at reducing wealth-based detention and pretrial detention for our county, for Cuyahoga County. And the reason for that is we want to promote racial and income equity, diversion, as well as community-based alternatives to incarceration. People should not be held in pretrial detention if they do not pose a risk to public safety, or if their wealth or lack thereof is a barrier to them to be able to maintain their social ties and connections to the community. We're also looking at juvenile justice, again, looking at community-based alternatives to incarceration and not having our carceral system as the default for behaviors or the first thing that we turn to in terms of punishment and retribution. We want to focus on restorative justice and healing where possible. The third priority is improving systems alignment and connectivity between pretrial services and mental and behavioral health response systems. We know that a significant, if not the majority of the adult jail population has either a mental health illness or behavioral illness, such as substance abuse, or sometimes what we call comorbid. They have both. And these people tend to be the most frequently incarcerated, either in pretrial detention or post, because as a community, we have not figured out how to treat this population and keep them out of the carceral system or keep them out of emergency rooms and things of that nature. So creating more alignment by focusing on community-based alternatives, whether that be housing, support services, training the workforce that works with that population, so on and so forth. And then the last priority we have is improving and expanding reentry services and community integration by focusing on policy advocacy and legislative efforts. The reason our emphasis is on policy and advocacy is, as I'll explain in a minute, is that we want to focus on the systems that create barriers to reentry versus just programming. Often what happens is we focus on what I like to call the fish or the individual and try to look at what are that individual's barriers to education and housing, instead of focusing on the systems that create these barriers for a large multitude of people. So by focusing on the system, we can have a greater impact with our grant dollars and also educate the public and elected and civic stakeholders in the process of how laws and policies or even administrative barriers can make it more difficult for people to reintegrate. So on our next slide, I share our theory of change. Is it working?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is. Oh, there we go.
Okay. So first, we use the social movement ecology model, which has three parts. One is personal transformation, again, where they focus on individuals, either through direct service and programming. The second part of that pie is looking at alternatives. So we want to build alternatives to the present institutions and cultures, again, not using incarceration as the default for how we deal with certain behaviors in our society. And the third part of that theory is changing the dominant institutions or the status quo. Right now, our status quo is prisons, jails, incarceration, death penalty, a range of things, and it's not what we see as healing, seeing as how do we prevent people from going into those systems by addressing their social determinants of health, addressing their lived environment, so on and so forth. So our funding strategy is really leaning on changing those dominant institutions, those systems and practices that incarcerate people, and then secondarily, the alternatives, wanting to support the alternatives through empowering community members and agencies who are using systems change, policy, and advocacy to birth those alternatives to life. So on our next slide, the reason that we have this purpose is, again, an alignment with that theory of change, because we want to direct resources to community and grassroots organizations, as well as advocacy networks and coalitions that are going to place pressure on that status quo to change not only the thinking of those stakeholders and those dominant institutions, but also to educate resident leaders and how they also can use advocacy and policy. Because as we know, social change movements in our country were not from the top down, they were from the bottom up. But if the bottom is not resourced adequately, they may not have the financial or even human capital resources to be able to affect the change that we're looking for. And so the grant dollars hopefully will not only assist you on this call if you are awarded a grant, but those who might also have a history of justice or criminal involvement and are committed to dismantling the criminal legal systems and practices that have historically harmed Black and minority people. So that's why we have this particular RFP as part of our theory of change. And so eligible organizations, again, we are a community foundation, so we can only grant to 501c3 organizations. So that tax exempt status, if someone doesn't have that tax status, we highly encourage you to use a fiscal sponsor. And the budget limitation is not applicable to the fiscal sponsor, but to the entity ultimately receiving the funds. So the budget is 1.5 million. Again, we're trying to target those community and grassroots groups to help build their capacity to affect the change in the area of criminal legal reform that they're going after. Again, the footprint of the Cleveland Foundation is Cuyahoga Lake and Geauga counties. So the potential applicant, you might either must be based in or predominantly working in our geographic footprint. The funding cannot go to support national work. It must benefit one of these three counties. And the focus must also be on reforming the criminal legal system as we define in the RFP as the police, courts, and correctional institutions, and all the different actors and parts attached to those parts of the system. So this is a priority consideration. If an organization or agency or network doesn't meet this, it doesn't exclude you, but we really want to try to support as much as possible those, again, who are part of a social justice focused group or network or coalition, because we realize that collaborative efforts help further change. We also want to try to support organizations that are including people with direct lived experience, since their voices are often marginalized and not uplifted. So including them could be anything from including them as volunteers, including them in part of your strategic planning process, including them in community organizing efforts, them serving as a board, serving as a staff. It's really flexible, but try to include them as much as possible. And we also want to try to support Black-led organizations whose leaders have experience with criminally, legally involved people, again, to just have more of those voices represented, since the criminal legal system has negatively impacted Black and people of color communities most predominantly. We have 2 levels of grant amounts, and I'll go over really briefly which one you might want to try to pursue depending on where you are. So we have 10 grants of $25,000 and 5 grants of $50,000 for a total of $500,000 that we will be granting out. So if to apply for the 50,000 grant, our guidance is that, again, you must engage in advocacy, policy, systems change, base building, et cetera. Usually organizations will have like a strategic plan or a policy agenda in place, usually have 2 to 3 experienced staff members, and active board of directors are in the process of forming one, and you can demonstrate how the grant funding will further your change efforts, and you have secured funding from at least 1 or 2 additional sources. The best way that I can summarize this is usually you're a bit more organized in terms of what your plan is, identifying your mission and goals. You have staff members who are dedicated to the organization or coalition, and you're very clear and focused versus someone who might be, or some entity that might be newer, may not quite yet have a board established, or their new board members, or you're mostly comprised of volunteers. So that would be like the next slide at the 25K grant. Organizations, so if you only have like 1 experienced staff member, or you only have like a core group of volunteers, or you're still kind of hashing out your strategic plan or policy agenda, I would really say that you may not yet have the capacity to handle a 50K grant, and you should apply for 25,000 to help you in that developmental process. Okay. So this is our timeline. The application has already opened. We have started our technical and grant writing assistance workshops. The application deadline is at 11:59 on May 5th. We will not accept applications after that time. We're going to have the first review process, again, just screening for eligibility. And if you meet that, you will receive notification no later than May 19th. Then we have a review teams who will be reviewing applications, and those applicants advancing to the final stage will receive notification in early July, and our final funding decisions will be made either at the end of June or early July. If you are a final applicant, you will receive that notification, but know that we still have an internal process of processing that, so that the checks will not actually be deposited in early July. It may be closer to end of August or early September, so please plan for that. And then this is just some quick steps about how to apply. We did a workshop yesterday, and we'll be posting the recording online very soon that shows you how to create an organizational profile, how to go in and start the application. We now do have a 2-factor authentication process. So, and the steps for that. So I encourage you, even if have not written out your answers to the application, at least go in and create an organizational profile and log in, so that you can get that out of the way, and you're not waiting until the last minute to try to create that and running into snags. So I understand this is a lot of information, so if there are any questions thus far, we're just going to pause quickly.
I don't have any questions right now. Nope. I'm good.
Okay.
I love all this attention. I feel like Ruby Bridges.
Hi, Merle.
Awesome.
Oh, there's somebody else?
That's Yvonne in there with you. Same group.
Oh, girl, I didn't know you were here.
Yes, I'm here.
Good
But
morning.
I don't have any
I'm so
questions
glad
either. I'm listening in.
I'm so glad you're here. Good morning.
Good morning.
In case you don't catch everything, of course, you're an expert at that. I was trying to fill in the gaps and take some notes.
I love it. I love it.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to be quiet now, and I'm going to allow Lisa to jump into the next portion of our session.
Okay, and there'll be plenty of time to answer questions throughout. So we're not going to make you wait till the end. So if you have anything, it'll just be a couple seconds. So there's another question screen. So even before you apply, I think there's always some things to consider before you even take the time to do an application. And like one is, does your organization have the capacity to take on this expanded work or new work, even with the dollars you might get from this grant? And that could mean like, do you have the administrative capacity to track the funds and how you spend them? Or will you have the staffing capacity to complete the program, even if the grant is going to pay for some of that staff? So that's one thing to consider. And then how many grants are being awarded versus your experience? I don't know that that's as applicable to this, because this is a pretty specific RFP. But you always want to think about, is this something you're really experiencing, and a foundation's going to look at your work and say, oh, they know how to do this. They're ready for a grant in this, as opposed to if, there's a large RFP and you think maybe you could start doing something, but there's only 2 grants awarded. It's one of those things like of considering, is it worth your time to apply? Do you have the right partners now, or can you build the right partners by May 5th on the deadline in order to put in a good proposal? And that could be partners in your work. That could be if you don't have a 501c3 and you need a fiscal agent and you need to figure out how that's going to work. If you're going to need consultants to help you build your capacity to do some aspect of your work, can you get partnerships? Oh, as we all know, partnerships always take longer than you think they're going to take. And so that's just something to consider. And then one other thing to consider is if you're using a fiscal sponsor or a fiscal agent, are they going to give you access to the system to enter your information, or are they going to do it for you? And so if they're going to do it for you, you just need to allow time for that. You need to, give them time to review, because ultimately, they're responsible for how you spend the funds. So they might want to review your proposal as well as have the time to have someone submit it into the Cleveland Foundation grant system. And then the next thing is I'm talking about just general best practices for grant writing. In case this is really, if you're not that experienced in grant writing, just some things to think about. And even if you are experienced, they're good reminders of things. And the first one about reading the guidelines in the entire application, it seems obvious, but like I've been doing this for 20 years and sometimes I forget. And then you don't want to it's basically because you don't want to be surprised. You want to know what you're doing. You want to know what questions are being asked so you can put your answers in the right places. You want to know what attachments are going to be required. So at the end, you're not like, oh my gosh, I don't have a budget, or I don't have an audit. I have to get that from somebody. So just sitting down and taking the time to read everything first will really help you out in the end. Creating a timeline is nice, especially if you're counting on other people or partners to do certain things related to the grant application. And I like to, if I'm working on a project that has a lot of partners, I like to put together a spreadsheet. Who's supposed to do it? When do they do it? Yes or no, did they do it? And this is more to help you track, and also in case you're needing to push somebody at the end and say, remember that you agreed to have this done by May 3rd and now it's May 4th and I still need it. It's just kind of a good backup for yourself. Follow directions. That kind of lines back up with the first bullet. Just make sure, for example, if there's a data question and it's asking you for percentages, that you're not putting in numbers instead of percentages. It's especially when you get towards the end of a deadline, sometimes things get stressful and you just don't want to miss something. You don't want to forget to put in an attachment or something like that. And then another is to write presuming that the reviewer doesn't know anything about what you do. I know the reviewers, there's certainly knowledgeable reviewers for this and a lot in every other RFP, but just because they know about the overall topic doesn't necessarily mean that they know specifically the kind of work you do. So I always try to write things presuming that whoever's reading it doesn't know a thing about it. And so that, trying to make sure they don't have to think or go look something up, or that you're really clearly presenting them with your work. And then I always try to follow the 3 C's when I write grants: clear, concise, and compelling. In this application, you have to be concise because there's the word limits, and so you can't really do something too long, but that sometimes on one hand, that's great because it doesn't mean you're tempted to write, 10 pages of something, but it also means you really have to clarify and get to the point quickly. Another thing I like to do is use a lot of headings, especially where there are word limits, because, you could say, instead of, wasting 4 words saying the mission of our organization is blah, 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 you can just say mission, colon, and then you save words for, the good stuff. And it also, to me, sometimes it helps when you don't have a good segue and you don't really know how to connect a couple things, and you don't have the word space to do it. Putting things under headings takes out the need for like a lead-in sentence that connects what you're saying to the paragraph before. So I especially find that headings helpful when there's word limits or character limits in a grant proposal. Define abbreviations the first time you use them kind of goes back to presuming people don't know what you're talking about. So, you don't have to define, I don't know, US, things that are generic. I think like LGBTQIA, I think people know what that is. But if it's something related to your work, I would just err on the side of defining every abbreviation just to make sure that the person reading knows what you're talking about. Answer the questions that are asked in the application really goes back to, we all want to talk about our projects and our organizations and give the most information because we're so excited about what we do. And sometimes, I know I do it, you tend to say, well, I have room here, even though this what I want to say doesn't answer this question. I want the foundation to know we do this. And I think it's just a best practice not to do that, because they're asking a question in a certain place because they want to know that answer. And if you don't fill up the space, you don't fill up the space, but you don't want to muddy up the question that they're looking for an answer to with additional information. And then finally, just leave enough time for review. The last day always feels like I'm almost done, and then you're not really almost done. You need to review it. Maybe your CEO needs to review it. If you're using a fiscal sponsor, they need to review it. I think I always try to say I'm going to submit things 2 days ahead of time. I mean, we all know that doesn't always happen, but if you have your goal to say, okay, this is going to be submitted May 3rd, then if it doesn't, and you still have a couple days to mess around with things. So not waiting till the last minute definitely benefits, I think, everybody's mental health, as well as making sure things get done on time. And then just in general for the application, here tips I was, thinking that could be helpful. This might be obvious, but draft it in Word. Don't try to type your answers into the boxes because they're really small, and, it's just much easier to do it in Word. And then you can also more easily count the words for your word limits. A lot of the questions in this application are 150 words or 300 words. And so 300 words is around a half a page. So that was just a tip to get you going. And then I just put a little information on, in case you've never done a word count, how to find the word count in Word. And just so you know that the formatting won't transfer. So you don't need to do bolding. You don't need to put things in color. You don't need to put things in italics because it won't transfer over. Bullets will transfer a little bit. Like if you would do one section of bullets, you'll be able to see it when you copy and paste it into the system. But you don't want to do where you have like a bullet, then a sub bullet, then a sub bullet, because they'll all line up together and it won't make any sense. One thing I do with formatting is going back to headings, is that since you can't bold or underline a heading, a lot of times I'll put the headings in all caps so that it just stands out as different. And then, that's like one trick I found over time. But, I just hate to see anybody try to do nice formatting when it doesn't matter in the system if you format or not, because it'll go away when you transfer it in there. Katrice touched on this a little bit, but the foundation's grant system requires you to fill out an organizational profile. And when you sign up for an account, you'll have to do it like right away. But even if you already have an account at the Cleveland Foundation, before you complete your application, it's going to ask you, did you update your organizational profile? If not, do that before you fill out this application. So these are the things that are included in the organizational profile. And I think, Katrice, these slides are going to be available, right?
Correct, along with the recording.
Okay. So that's just so you have that in front of you. It's another thing. You don't want to be, I don't want anybody to be surprised when you think you're ready to go and you go to submit and then you have this other information that you need to work on. So that is good to have in advance of either right when you apply for a Cleveland Foundation account or before you're going to submit your application. And then, so I think we're going to go back to Katrice to talk about the different sections and the questions, and kind of what Katrice is looking for as you fill out your application. So we're going to start with section 1. And I think right after this, there's questions. So like after one more screen, we'll be able to stop for questions if anyone has any.
Absolutely. So as Lisa mentioned, you'll create your organizational profile. And again, these sections are included in the applicant guide that's on our blog post, so you can always refer to that. But your project title, it could just be the name of your organization or your coalition, or if you have a specific project title, that's where you would put that. The coordinator contact is the person submitting the application and who's going to receive updates about the application. So you want to make sure whoever's going to be that coordinator is going to let everyone else know the status of the application and regularly check for updates. And also, if we're screening the applications and we have questions, that person is going to be responsive to our emails. So whoever that is for you, I would designate that person as the coordinator contact so that they receive it, and just remind them that they should be looking out for emails if we have questions. The executive director contact is going to be the leader of your organization, agency, or coalition. And that could be potentially the same person as the project leader contact. The reason that we have these two differentiating contacts is because it could be that you are a part of a coalition and you've designated another organization in that coalition to submit the application. I don't know all of the dynamics or all for the applicants, but we just wanted to provide that. So the executive director would be the contact person of the lead organization, agency, or coalition, and the project leader contact could be the same person, but only if it differs from the applicant, submitter, or the executive director. Okay.
Okay.
Any questions thus far?
I don't have any.
Okay.
So this is about your work. Again, this is where words are going to be really, really tight. So again, the first one is just your mission, vision, and goals. This should be relatively easy. If you're a part of a coalition, I have been providing guidance that you can decide to submit an application only for your coalition, but if you have numerous organizations that have 501c3 status who are each taking on kind of different roles in the coalition, they each also can submit applications, and in which case they would submit the mission for their organization. So you kind of have to decide as an applicant, are you only going to submit one application on behalf of the entire coalition and then distribute the funds if they're awarded, or if you want each different organization to submit an application, again, differentiating your roles within that coalition, that we're going to leave that up to the applicant or applicants to decide. We don't want to be prescriptive in how you do that. And then for the project campaign overview description, again, 300 words. We want a very concise statement of what you're looking to do. And if you have multiple partners that you're working with as part of this work, my best advice would be just to name those partners instead of providing us with the trustees of their mission and this expansive explanation, because our reviewers are reviewing multiple applications, and so try to keep it concise. The same thing for your top 1 to 3 priorities. What are your priorities for your organization or you as the applicant. Again, keep these very, very concise as much as possible. And then we have a section about context where we ask what part of the criminal legal system that you're responding to, and or what local or state policy or system changes that you're hoping that you will affect. This doesn't need to be particularly verbose. The concise, the better. And then the last question under context is asking, how are you using systems change, policy advocacy, as well as movement building or organizing strategies to achieve your goals? And again, that can be quite broad. It could be resident engagement. It could be directly engaging with elected leaders. It could be, organizing buses to the General Assembly. It could be, talking to systems actors. It could be doing research. It could be narrative change. It's kind of quite broad, and the different activities that you can do under, the things that we described there. So moving on, again, this kind of reflects back to our priority consideration. We want to include the voices of people who have had current or prior justice involvement or directly impacted. Justice involvement can include anything from someone who's been arrested to all the way through to pretrial detention, all the way through to serve time in jail or prison, whether they be adult or juvenile. And directly impacted could be that individual or their friends or family members who have been negatively, usually some people positively, but I don't want to suggest that here, or it could be their friends or family member, but again, including the voices of those folks who have experience so that they can have a part in what that alternative looks like, or have a part in what it is that you're envisioning. It's not required, but it is highly suggested. And then is a sub part to that. If you have any leadership or decision-making roles that justice involved or directly impacted people are a part of, you could have space to write about that there. Or if they're not yet involved, or if you have intentions of involving them, you can include that too. Oops. Sorry. Okay, and then this section kind of looks at your capacity. Capacity can be anything from financial resources, volunteers, staff, board members. Again, just kind of looking at that there's actually a physical living person, at least one, to do the work or to manage the project. That's what we are asking by that question. And then the second question, you have an opportunity to tell us why you're seeking this grant support. It could be to support your general capacity building and operational needs, or it could be something very specific and targeted. It could be, for instance, to lead a resident training. Could be to organizing an event for public education, or it can be participatory action research for adults or juveniles. Again, it's up to the applicant to kind of describe how you are seeking to use those funds, including for staff salaries, to meet with a consultant to help you with their strategy or plan, or a range of things. And then the third question is for coalitions and partnerships only. We want to look at your history of collaboration and what role each group or organization is playing in that proposed work. Again, this gives more information to our reviewers, and it also kind of goes to this underlying principle that change is more effective the more capacity and collaboration that you have. Again, not a requirement, but as you look to build consensus around something, the more that you can build that capacity, the stronger your voice will be. So we would like to hear about that if you have that. And then finally, we ask, how much experience do you or your organization have in criminal legal reform? This is going to be a checkbox. If you have 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5, that just, again, helps us be cognizant of what your capacity and resources may be. Any questions about these sections? And then section 3 looks at the use of funds. Again, you will select the amount that you're going for, either 25 or 50K. Again, use that guidance that we provided in the applicant guide to kind of measure where you might be at in terms of organizational development or network or coalition development. And then you will have a checkbox to select the top 2 areas of where you will use funding. And then we have requested expenses, which is a truncated budget. But how do you expect to use the funds? The categories are fairly straightforward, whether it be staff salary, travel, mailing and postage, other. And then the final question asks, if awarded a grant, how soon will you begin your proposed activities, whether it be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months? So we have an idea of how quickly you look to expend the funds. And then demographic data, this is something that the foundation is starting to collect so that we can understand the diversity among our grantees. So looking at the racial demographic of your leaders, executive director, or community or coalition team members. The second one goes to the board of directors. If you don't have a board, but maybe you have an advisory board, whether it be committee or some other kind of configuration, you would include percentages there, and then also include the racial makeup of your staff and volunteers. Again, they don't have to be precise, but just approximations is sufficient. And then we also have space for attachments. So for the budget, so you can for the attachments, you can attach information about your board of directors or advisory committee. That's optional, not mandatory. For the budget, you would do your annual budget, which can be in the form of an Excel spreadsheet saved as a PDF. It can be in a Word document, or it can be a most recent 990 or a financial audit. When you do your budget, I think there are some good examples online about how to construct that. You would have to do that for this application anyway, but I think it's just also good organizational tool for you to have, not only for the potential grant from the Cleveland Foundation, but any source of funding that you have. You want to make sure you have a budget that accurately reflects things like staff salaries, reimbursements to volunteers for travel, food expenses, so on and so forth. And you have also the option for an additional attachment that you believe will support your application. So that can be anything from a trifold that describes your work. It could be a sample campaign you've done. It could be a list of your coalition partners. And as just, again, a brief, concise summary of what their mission is and vision. I would not limit it to that. Anything that's going to support the application, but it should not be a 30-page document where you try to fit in answers to the previous answers, because you want to be cognizant that people are reviewing your application, and if they have to spend 5 hours on it, they're probably not going to read the attachment. So you want to make sure that the attachment is relevant to your application. Any questions thus far about budget, the attachments? Okay. So finally, Lisa will cover some additional resources.
Right, as Katrice said, the technical, this recording will be online. The technical assistant recordings from that happened yesterday, and another one that's coming up will be online. Application guide, and when you get these slides, when they're available, these links will work for you to get right to them. There's an article about fiscal sponsorship basics that if you're planning on using a fiscal sponsor for this opportunity, I'll just kind of give you some basics about how it works and things to think about. And then there's Candid is an organization in town that you might or might not know about. They're a national organization, but we were lucky enough to have some local people here, and they do really great classes in general about a variety of things related to working in and running a nonprofit. And they've got a 1-hour introduction to proposal writing you can do on demand, or there's actually a live online class, and there's one next week. And same thing for doing budgets. They're both very, very good, short, free They're good. It's a good resource to just kind of get you thinking about some best practices related to submitting applications. And then I just included a couple other grant writing resources that I know about that are both really good. And again, like the one's just a blog, but there's a lot of good topics about grant writing in that blog. And then the Grants Magic does trainings. A lot of them are free. Some of them you have to pay for, to be fair, but I've done a lot of their trainings, and they're very good and very user friendly. So those are just some things, if you're newer to grant writing, that might be helpful as you prepare this application.
And that is the scope of resources, overview of the questions. So thank you for coming. I'm going to stop the recording and